Hello, this is another recording related to political science 415 and 515 public policy. So this is a continuation of the discussion from last time. We had established a fictional presidential candidate, a Republican presidential candidate named Valerie Bibbs, who I believe, is from Tennessee. And we had gone through and kind of looked at economic policy and tax policy, and the policy selections were randomly selected by the computer. And we talked about how some of the policy choices that were randomly selected probably didn't fit very well with uh, Bibbs being a Republican, whereas others did fit better. So we're going to continue that discussion of policy, but I want to, rather than kind of going down the line and addressing all of the policy options under a particular category, I wanted to hit some key questions that are particularly relevant for the discussion going on nationally, as well as issues that are going on in the state of Indiana. So again, this is a game called the Political Process, and it's being played in dictator mode. But you can access this game through the Steam app. So if you go to, I think it's www.steam.com, it's a game platform, and then the platform itself is free. But then, this game I think was about $15 or something like that. So you don't need to purchase it, but if you're interested in where this came from, I just kind of wanted to give you that background. So we're going to go back to the policy tab, and we'd already gone through a lot of the economic tax policy. So we're going to skip down to education policy. And again, I don't want to go down the line and talk about each of these. But the one that I really want to focus on, because it's particularly relevant for the state of Indiana, is the idea of supporting or opposing school choice. So it asks, do you support or oppose school choice, a policy where parents are allowed to use tax funds designated for their child to select which public or private school their child will attend? So again, using the random selection function, this has the presidential candidate Bibbs, or I guess she is actually president and seeking reelection, but it has her supporting school choice, which as a Republican actually fits with what you would expect her ideology to be. A lot of Republicans do support the idea of school choice, because if the idea is that if your child is going to if you live in a particular school district and the schools in that district are not performing well, there should be some kind of mechanism to allow you to transfer your student from a failing school to a different school so that they have an opportunity for a better education. And the idea is that, if a child is in a school that's failing and the parents want to move the child out, that they shouldn't be having to pay the full financial burden of that themselves, that it makes sense that some tax funds be used to allow that transfer to occur. So, it fits with the Republican idea of kind of individual choice and personal freedom, because again, um, you know, you you may have disagreements with some things that are being taught in the public school, and that's part of your reason for wanting to transfer your child out. In addition to just being able to say, this school is not performing well, and if it was any other kind of service and the service wasn't being performed well, you wouldn't keep going to the same business or the same doctor or the same lawyer and that kind of thing. So why does it make sense that, children are sort of obligated to attend a particular school even if that school is not performing? So from the Republican perspective, which again is where Bibbs would probably be coming from, it would make sense to support this kind of policy, and there's been a lot of support for school choice and for providing uh, tuition subsidies and things to allow students to move from public school into various private schools and things like that. The other side of the argument from the more democratic perspective or more liberal perspective would be that uh, by taking public funds out of the public education system and basically transferring that money to the private system, you're creating a cycle where the public institutions are sort of doomed to fail, because if the public schools are having issues because they're underfunded, but they're having more of their funding being taken away and diverted to private institutions, which may not really need that revenue. You're creating a situation where you're making the public school problem worse. Now, uh, some people might argue that, well, in sort of a capitalist system or in the private sector, if a business is failing, if a business isn't performing well and it fails, that's kind of how it's supposed to work. Um, but the issue here is that um, unless every child is going to have access to this kind of waiver and can afford to go to a private school, there's always going to be some students that are going to be dependent on public school. And if we're taking money out of that system and putting it into the private sector, then it's really going to put those students who have no option to move to a private school in even an even more dire situation than they otherwise would be. So one thing about a lot of these tuition subsidies and things that are being offered is they don't necessarily pay for the full cost of going to those private institutions. So it's still up to parents of the children to pay some of that themselves. And that may not be within the means of people who are, lower income or even, on the lower end of what we would consider to be middle class. So, the one of the most significant arguments against sort of the proliferation of school choice is this idea that, yes, some of the schools are underperforming, but allowing a certain fortunate percentage of students to leave those institutions and take tax money with them is only going to further disadvantage those students that are left in the schools and just kind of accentuate or exacerbate the social inequality that the education system is already kind of generating. So, um, think about the school choice perspective. Um, you can think about from the perspective of a Republican. Is there a Republican argument or a conservative argument that one could use in opposition to the idea of school choice? Or I like for instance, last time I said, talk about from the perspective of being a Republican, should Bibbs change her position? Or you can talk about, is the other position the preferable position? So is it, in your view, should school choice be largely opposed in the political process? So you can kind of take either approach. Should Bibbs change her position? And kind of think about, if you were trying to convince Bibbs to change her position, what argument would you use? So a big topic that's currently in the news as I record this, and I'm recording this on, I think, February 7th of 2024. So there's been an immigration plan, a bipartisan immigration plan that's been circulating in Congress, and um, there's a question of is it going anywhere? Is it going to pass in the Senate? Is it going to pass in the House of Representatives? Chances for it passing seem very, very small at this point. There's a lot of Republican opposition in the House. But one key question when it comes to immigration policy is uh, supporting or opposing a path to citizenship for people who came into the country illegally, but who meet certain requirements. So they don't have a criminal record, they're employed, they've been, uh, good residents of the country, contributed to their communities, all those kinds of things, paid taxes. So the immigration bill that's currently being circulated as of February of 2024 does not include this path to citizenship. That's part of the reason why it has been able to generate bipartisan support, because Democrats tend to support a path to citizenship, whereas Republicans often oppose a path to citizenship from the perspective that they see it as kind of rewarding criminal behavior. Uh, the argument is we have a legal immigration process that people should go through. And if people are trying to skip the legal process and just cross the border and uh, try to reap the benefits of living in the US without going through the proper channels, that shouldn't be rewarded. Whereas other people argue that a lot of the people who are undocumented, who come here under illegal circumstances, uh, they're coming out of desperation. They're not coming with any malicious intent, not trying to do any harm. They're just trying to safety or make a better life for their families. And if they can come over here and establish a life, establish roots in a community, get a job, do what they're supposed to do, what we would expect a citizen to do in this country, um, that they should be able to uh, at least have a path to get to citizenship. Not that, citizenship should automatically be granted, but there should be some kind of process that these undocumented individuals can go through under certain circumstances to eventually get to citizenship. And there's the argument that there's been a lot of uh, individuals who've been come here undocumented, particularly as children, who have served in the military and really contributed significantly to the country. So shouldn't those contributions be rewarded in some way, even if the root of them being here is an illegal act? So it opposes the path to citizenship, which again, talking about it from a Republican perspective makes sense. Would kind of put her, I think, with the mainstream of the party. So you can kind of think about, if you were going to try to advocate to President Bibbs, that she should support a path to citizenship, what kinds of arguments would you make to try to convince her to do that? Given that she is a Republican and is likely to hold that kind of hard line, sort of law and order perspective on immigration. So the next thing is I wanted to skip down to energy policy. And I wanted to kind of look at these questions about solar energy and wind energy. So it asks questions. Do you think there should be more, less, or equal emphasis on producing solar energy? And she has written equal. She has responded equal. So solar energy should continue to receive some federal subsidies, some federal support, but no additional support, which I don't think is outside the realm of expectations for Republican politicians. I do think there is some support for solar energy in the Republican Party. There seems to be a little bit less support for wind energy. Obviously, President Trump has been very critical of the use of windmills and things like that. So the fact that she indicated more emphasis on producing wind energy would seem to kind of put her at odds maybe with the rest of her party. So maybe, putting that more at equal or less might be more likely. But I wanted to talk about this in terms of kind of the relationship between those questions and the question about coal. Do you think there should be more or less or equal emphasis on producing coal? And she put more, which for a Republican politician, particularly a politician coming from Tennessee, where I believe there's still some coal industry in Tennessee, and obviously they're a neighbor to Kentucky, which is a coal state. So it seems logical for a politician who's a Republican from Tennessee to be supportive of more emphasis on coal. So the kind of the issue to think about is balancing these things. The idea of I guess there's the first question of should a politician be supportive of both kind of traditional energy production, oil drilling, coal mining, those kinds of things, and clean energy. Should they kind of put those things on an equal playing field, or should one take precedence over the other? And should more traditional energy sources take precedence, or should more emphasis be placed on clean energy? So from a kind of conservative Republican perspective, most politicians would tend to favor more traditional energy production. A lot of Republican politicians argue that there needs to be more emphasis on domestic oil production and coal production and natural gas, because the U.S. needs to be more energy independent. We need to be less dependent on oil from the Middle East and other countries. We need to be able to produce more of our own energy. And while the idea of clean energy is good, Republicans argue that it's just not efficient enough. It's just not well developed enough to really meet our energy needs at this point. So we need to continue to put a lot of our resources and a lot of our energy into cleaner sources. The counterpoint to that, the Democratic argument or the liberal argument is that because of the greenhouse effect, because of climate change, it's becoming more and more of a health and safety imperative that we transition away from burning coal and burning oil and doing more with solar and with wind. And even some people argue that nuclear is a better alternative, and obviously nuclear energy comes with its own set of issues. But kind of the democratic perspective is that energy, the idea of energy independence is good, um, but we also need to balance the the harm that we're doing. You know, the idea that climate change is creating more severe storms, which come at significant economic costs as well as safety costs and health costs. And the fact that if climate change is not slowed down and eventually brought under control, that it's going to create a lot of global disruptions in terms of migratory patterns and things like that. So the argument is that even though there's going to be some very serious near-term economic downsides and inefficiencies in moving to cleaner energy, if we don't take that stance, if we don't take that approach, there's going to be existential concerns. The very existence of the country, the very existence of the ability of humans to survive on the planet are going to be affected. And that kind of brings us into the next question, which is more specifically focused on environmental policy. So the question I wanted to look at under environmental policy kind of is in the same realm. Do you support or oppose mandatory controls on carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases? So that's, and in this instance, Bibb is listed as supporting those kinds of mandatory controls. That's kind of questionable from a Republican perspective, because a lot of Republicans are very skeptical of regulations, strict regulations, when it comes to climate change. I mean, there are still a lot of Republican politicians that are skeptical of, climate change. There's less skepticism that climate change is occurring. More and more people are acknowledging the idea that there is climate change, that the environment is changing in certain ways. But there's skepticism about the degree to which human activity affects that change, and the degree to which changing our energy infrastructure and our manufacturing and things like that will be able to affect changes in the climate. So because of that skepticism, or because of that questioning, Republicans tend to take a dimmer view of these kind of mandatory regulations dealing with climate change, because they argue that we're going to be putting the U.S. economy at a disadvantage. We're going to be disadvantaging Americans who work in manufacturing sectors and the sectors that are producing these emissions, potentially costing jobs and putting families at risk and communities at risk, when we don't really know what actual benefit we'll see from doing these kinds of regulations. The counter to that, of course, is that, similar to what I was talking about before, if we don't take decisive action on regulating carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases, that we'll eventually reach a point, and some scientists have argued we've already reached that point, where it'll be too late to take action effectively. we'll reach a tipping point and it'll be too late to really halt the really devastating effects of climate change that are going to be disruptive to the survival of American society and disruptive to society at large across the globe. So again, it kind of gets down to this argument about um, to what extent will these regulations be effective in halting climate change? Do those effects outweigh the economic harm that is going to affect American families? Essentially, the question of, is this an existential threat? Is this something where if we don't take action, that eventually, humanity would no longer be able to live on the planet? And that's still a matter of dispute between conservatives and progressives. So, but again, Republicans just in general, less inclined to favor regulations, except under certain particular circumstances. Democrats are more in favor of regulations, especially if they're accomplishing what they see as being a greater public good. So the last thing I want to talk about really quickly is regulating prescription drug costs. So there has been action taken recently, for example, to limit the cost of insulin to, I think, like $30 a month or something along those lines, because the cost of insulin had gotten extremely high, and a significant percentage of Americans are diabetic and do need insulin. So for this, it says that Bibbs is in support of regulating prescription drug prices. And there is bipartisan support on this. Addressing prescription drug prices was something that was talked about during the Trump administration, although decisive action wasn't really taken during that administration. And the Biden administration has been a little bit more active on the issue. And again, that regulation's been put into place. So the question would be, should there be broader regulation of prescription drug prices? And again, Bibbs, even though she's a Republican and Republicans tend to be less supportive of regulation, supports it. But this isn't outside the realm of possibility, because there are a number of Republicans that do support this kind of regulation. The traditional Republican argument against regulating prescription drugs is the idea that if we limit the profitability of prescription drugs, it reduces the incentive for the pharmaceutical industry and for those doing research associated with the pharmaceutical industry to continue to innovate and to continue to find new medications and new treatments. Because if they're doing it from the perspective of seeking economic reward, but the government is limiting how much can be charged for these drugs, there's less incentive to innovate. There's less incentive to create. So that's kind of a big part of the Republican argument is we need to be careful that we're not taking the profit motive out of the pharmaceutical industry, because then they're going to be less productive. The sort of counter argument to that is that pharmaceutical companies are making massive amounts of money, so to reduce some of that profit coming in isn't necessarily going to cripple the pharmaceutical industry. But then, even that being said, a lot of the research and development, the creation of these new drugs, a lot of that is being supported one way or another by tax money whether that's government grants or however that's being done. There is government involvement in the creation and production of these drugs. So therefore, the government should be able to step in and have some say in how much is charged for these drugs. So so it kind of comes down to the argument again, looking at regulation. If we look at it from a cost benefit perspective, are these kinds of regulations going to be more beneficial than costly? So from the Republican perspective, the concern is by doing this, we're going to lose out on new innovative treatments. But from the Democratic side, the benefit of more people being able to afford prescription drugs and Medicaid and Medicare having to pay less for prescription drugs, the economic effects of that and the effects that'll have on the healthcare system are going to create economic benefits that perhaps can be used to outweigh some of those innovation issues that could come about. So there's a way to balance some of those issues out with some of the savings that will come from these prescription drug regulations. So that is, I think, all I wanted to cover. So think about the questions. Think about, is this a position, with the questions that we've talked about, is this a position that Bibbs should be taking as a Republican politician in 2024, a Republican president in 2024? And think about if you were going to try to change Bibbs's mind on one of these issues. Or maybe you want to take the opposite perspective and want to say, you want to get her to keep the position she already has. How would you argue for that position? So, take one or more of these questions and just kind of talk about, what position should Bibbs be taking and why should Bibbs be taking it? So I look forward to seeing the discussion in the comments. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Please send me a message through Canvas or email me at nathan.myers@indstate or nathan.myers@indstate.edu. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.